section G, Darwin disrupts the churches. So a lot of old-time churches during this time felt very vulnerable. There's a lot of books being published on comparative religion. There is a lot of criticism of the Bible through a historical perspective, kind of criticizing the history in the Bible. But the biggest idea that really disrupts Christianity are the ideas of British scientist Charles Darwin. Darwin came up with the idea of evolution. Evolution, the idea that higher forms or higher species had evolved from lower forms through the process of natural selection. Natural selection, really simple, the idea that organisms that had the superior genes were the ones that are likely to survive and pass on those genes to offspring. So over time, through this natural selection process, we'll see species evolve. All right. Well, that was a problem for some Christian churches because a lot of churches interpreted the Bible literally. Charles Darwin's ideas really clashed with their account of creation found in Genesis. The idea of this special creation, that God created each species individually. So, kind of out of response to that, we see a split in the Christian community. We have one group of Christians that are the minority who more or less reject Darwin's theories outright. They called it a bestial hypothesis. And that's really where we see the roots of modern-day fundamentalism. Interpreting the Bible literally, that sort of thing. There were some scientists at this time that also disagreed with Darwin on a scientific level. We have Louis Agassiz. He was a Harvard zoologist, and also Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he was a French biologist. However, by 1920-ish, most of the scientific community had really gotten behind Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. All right, so we're talking about the split in Christianity. We have kind of the fundamentalists, those who are interpreting the Bible literally, and then we have another group, kind of the majority. And what they do is they kind of adopt Darwin's ideas within Christianity. They said, evolution was more or less a fuller or a more revealed plan of God. So it was just a greater revelation of God's plan for humanity, or how he created humanity. And they more or less didn't have a problem with it. They said, no, it makes sense. Some were fearing that they would alienate the educated Christians among their congregation. So that was kind of one of the reasons why they adopted Darwinism within the Christian community. And we kind of see a shift with this as well. Now we see a shift from preachers being really involved with kind of science and that sort of thing. And now we see them kind of shying away from science and really focusing in on morality and family life. All right, section H, the lust for learning. That's an awkward title. Anyway, so after the Civil War, during this Gilded Age, we see a growth of public schools. People thought if a free government, if democracy was going to work, we need to make sure we have an educated population. We need to combat ignorance. More and more states were making elementary schools, at least, compulsory, meaning you have to attend. And this really helps combat the child labor that was occurring during this era. Before the Civil War, we had seen a couple hundred high schools. High schools were more or less very rare. But after the Civil War, we get a growth. We had about 6,000 high schools. And also the idea that elementary school and the secondary education was becoming a birthright of all Americans, something that every American was kind of entitled to. So with the growth of schools, we also see a growth of schools for teachers, places teachers can go to become educated. And these were called normal schools. In Iowa, if we're talking about Iowa, hooray, the University of Northern Iowa actually originated as a normal school. So in 1869, Iowa State Normal School was created as a place to teach teachers. Today we call it the University of Northern Iowa. All right. Also with education, we see more support for kindergartens being an idea that we adopted from the German immigrants. And also with this new flood of these new immigrants, a lot of them being Catholic, we see an increase in parochial schools or Catholic schools. Well, adults didn't want to be left out of education. A lot of adults didn't have the opportunity to go to school, and they wanted to find a place to learn as well. So we really see the rise of something called the Chautauqua movement. Chautauqua this movement started out in 1874 near Lake Chautauqua in New York. And what it was kind of like the Lyceum movement we talked about earlier, part 2. So it's kind of a circuit of lecturers who'd come into the city, lecture and educate the adults of the community. One of the most famous lecturers from the Chautauqua movement was Mark Twain. Mark Twain obviously being a very famous writer during this time. He had made a lot of money, but also lost most of his money through some bad investments. So he was kind of forced to go on the lecture circuit. And just in general, while we're talking about education, something was working during the Gilded Age. We found a lot of times the schools that were built in an urban setting were a lot more successful than those, one teacher, one room red schoolhouses we saw on the frontiers. A statistic that kind of proves that is the fact that in 1870, 20% of all Americans were illiterate. And that number drops a lot. It actually goes down to 10.7% in 1900. So we really do see an increase of education at this time. All right, section I, Booker T. Washington and education for Black people. All right, public education was the worst in the South, especially among blacks. Separate but equal was by no means equal. All right, in 1900, 44% of blacks were illiterate. And really the champion for black education was, as the title suggests, Booker T. Washington. Washington had been a slave, so he was an ex-slave, and he started a school for blacks in Tuskegee, Alabama. Okay? And his philosophy is rather unique. He wanted to work within the system, not overthrow it. His idea was, create schools, work hard, get an education. With an education, then blacks would become economically independent, and once blacks were economically independent, then they could work on social reform or getting kind of this social equality that they so wanted with the whites. So his idea is work the system, don't overthrow the system, work your way to the top of the ladder, and then once you kind of prove yourself, then equality will come naturally. Like I mentioned, Tuskegee Institute, very, very famous by the way, had a famous teacher, George Washington Carver. Kind of a fun fact, George Washington Carver is the one who discovered hundreds of uses for plants, especially the peanut, sweet potato, and soybean. And it really helped to boost the Southern economy. Right? You didn't just grow peanuts to eat anymore, right? You could make shampoo out of it. You could make them into paint, that sort of thing. So he was kind of a famous name to come out of Washington's Tuskegee Institute. Well, kind of on the flip side, not everyone agreed with Washington's ideas. Someone who's kind of went against them or had a different philosophy was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois had a different strategy. Du Bois thought that Washington's idea of working within the system wouldn't work. He was fearful that the strategy would fail to raise blacks beyond, just being manual laborers. He thought they'd be forever considered to be inferior, second-class citizens. W.E.B. Du Bois actually got his PhD from Harvard, so he is the first African American to do so. And he demanded complete equality for blacks. He didn't want to work within the system. He wanted equality now. And he's most famous for creating, of course, the NAACP, which stands for, right, NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He founded that in 1909. And his idea is he wanted the talented 10th, or the top 10% of blacks, to have kind of equal access to education, to really be trained well, and then that top 10% of blacks would become the leaders of the Black community and would help kind of pull the Black community along. So that's what W.E.B. Du Bois thought. He didn't want to work within the system. He wanted that top 10% of Blacks to really become educated, really to take kind of education by the horns, and then become leaders that'll kind of pull along the rest of the Blacks. Anyway, I mean, you can't talk about him without mentioning just how talented this guy was. W.E.B. Du Bois was an exceptional poet, sociologist, historian. He actually moved to Africa and died in 1963 at the age of 94, so he sticks around for a while. So really this section kind of showing education within the Black community, two separate ideas, the idea of Booker T. Washington working within the system, and then earning social equality, and then W.E.B. Du Bois more or less demanding social equality, at least for the top 10%, and then educating leaders that'll pull along the African American community. All right, section J, the hallowed halls of Ivy. So we're talking about Ivy League schools, colleges. That's what this section's talking about. So a lot of universities shot up following the Civil War. After the Civil War, it was becoming more and more necessary to get a college education if you wanted to be successful. We see some rise in women's colleges. Vassar was created, and also a lot of the colleges in the Midwest were becoming co-ed, allowing women in as well. A very couple famous Black colleges, Howard University in D.C., perhaps the most famous one. Also, the Hampton Institute in Virginia, Atlantic University, all of these were Black universities. And kind of asking the question, why do we see such a growth after the Civil War of colleges? Let me tell you, it had to do with an act of Congress, more specifically the Morrill Act, M-O-R-R-I-L-L, the Morrill Act. 1862 was passed, and what it did is, much like the railroads, it had its federal grants of land to the colleges. So a college could, one, build on the land, and two, it could sell the land to get money to fund the formation of colleges. And these are called land grant colleges. No, not creatively enough, I suppose. Anyway, so most of these land grant colleges became state universities. For example, within Iowa, 1864, Iowa State University was actually developed as a land grant college. Another act after the Morrill Act, I guess I pronounced it wrong, so the Morrill Act, was the Hatch Act in 1887, and this was just kind of an expansion of the Morrill Act, and it started to include stations for agricultural development as well. Now you know, kind of experiments to help along agriculture. Also, another huge source of funding for these baby colleges were philanthropists, okay? So industrial people who had made millions in industry would donate fortunes to help these kind of baby colleges along. Between 1878 and 1898, over $150 million were given to these colleges. Some examples of this donation stuff. John D. Rockefeller in 1892 more or less funded the University of Chicago into being. And also we see a growth of professional schools, or schools you would go to get a master's or a doctorate degree. The most famous one among them is Johns Hopkins. Before, many Americans, if they wanted to get their PhD or their master's, they had two choices. They could go to England or they could go to Germany. Well, Americans really didn't like the English, so a lot of Americans chose to go to Germany. But after Johns Hopkins was formed as this really kind of elite college to get a graduate degree, a lot of Americans said goodbye to Germany and hello to Johns Hopkins specifically. A famous graduate of Johns Hopkins is Woodrow Wilson. We'll talk about him later. He's the president. He got his PhD from Johns Hopkins. All right, continuing on, section K, the March of the Mind. Okay, the mind. So we're looking at colleges specifically still, but kind of a changing in curriculum we see developing at this time. Before the Civil War, and especially in the South, we had always seen that morality and the natural sciences were taught hand in hand. But after this, Darwinism came about, kind of in this wake to try to reconcile morality with science. Really what we see is a lot of times they would split the two apart. So it wasn't morality and science together. They kind of divorced the two. Facts and morals were divorced. And obviously then it was a greater emphasis on the facts or greater emphasis on the science, at the expense of the morality. We also see a shift in the traditional curriculum. It started to change. People were demanding more practical courses, right? Latin's really fun, but not super helpful all the time. So they wanted to see some practical courses. We see this growth of the idea of electives, like choosing which classes you want to take, and also, mind-blowing idea of having fields of study. So not everyone who goes to college learns or takes the exact same courses. So kind of emphasizing a field of study. Mind blown, right? A reformer in that regard was Dr. Charles Elliott. And in the 1870s, Dr. Charles Elliott, became the president of Harvard, and he was a big reformer. And we even see Harvard's motto shift from "for Christ and church" to simply the word truth. So that kind of is an example of the shift in education, kind of divorcing morality and science, emphasizing science for the sake of morality, seeing a shift in the curriculum away from these traditional like Latin courses into something that's more practical or more specific for what you're hoping to study. All right, talking about schools, let's talk about medical schools. Remember doctors? No one liked doctors. They didn't really know what they were doing. It starts to change after the Civil War. We see medical schools prospering, and generally we see an increase in public health and an increase in life expectancy in America. Some famous folks that are, making history at this time: Louis Pasteur. He was a French scientist, and he really discovered a lot of the principles that led us to using vaccines, and also, as you could guess through his name, the idea of pasteurizing milk or wine, the idea of this process that would stop, the spread of bacteria, that sort of thing. So yeah, Louis Pasteur. Also we have Joseph Lister, #Listerine guy, and he's an English doctor, and he kind of emphasizes the idea of microbiology, #germs. He starts, making sure that surgical knives are sterilized, that you keep wounds clean, that sort of thing. Really the idea that you have to have a clean environment when you're working in medicine, especially surgery. All right, and just in general, the general idea was pragmatism, the idea that a truth of the idea was to be tested above all by its practical consequences. So if the idea works, run with it. This idea was really put forth by a guy from Harvard who taught there like 35 years. His name was William James, and he actually wrote the book with the title Pragmatism. Kind of think pragmatism, practicality. If it works, keep it. If not, move on to a new theory. All right, section L, the appeal of the press. So we're shifting away from schools and into more books and journalism, that sort of thing, although of course the two are connected. So books became a huge source of entertainment at this time. A lot of people were reading the classics like David Copperfield, Ivanhoe. We see an increase in public libraries. They're kind of known as the poor man's university. In 1897, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. opened its doors and had 13 acres of floor space, kind of a big deal. Of course, Andrew Carnegie, trying to get rid of his millions, used a lot of his steel fortune, about $60 million of it, to fund public libraries, both in the U.S. and overseas. Even in Cedar Rapids, what is now the Museum of Art on 3rd Avenue actually originated as a library, a Carnegie library, a library built with funds from Carnegie. Another huge invention at this time is the linotype. Linotype was invented in 1885, and it really helped along the newspaper presses. It's a very intricate machine. More or less, back in the day before they had this machine, if you were going to print something, you had to hand pick out every single letter of every single word of every single sentence by hand. And more or less now the linotype, or am I saying that right? Yeah, the linotype machine more or less is a machine that puts the words together. So you have a big keyboard and you're typing on the keyboard and the machine is putting all the letters together. So when you're all said and done, that process is done by machine instead of by hand. Anyway, I was around to like the advent of the computers. But because of this, we really see it becoming very expensive to get into the newspaper business because these machines are very expensive. So the owners of these newspapers really didn't want to lose readers, so they really kind of shied away from any kind of controversial issues. They kind of stuck to fluff because everyone will read fluff, okay, because they don't want to lose the investment they made in these expensive machines. So we really see an increase of sensationalism, kind of human interest stories, fluff pieces, scandals, that sort of thing. And they really became popular, these kind of scandalous stories, for two reasons. One, commuters, on their way to work, they didn't really have time to read these hard-hitting exposés, right? They had, 15 minutes going to work. They wanted to read something just for entertainment. And also a lot of immigrants were illiterate and really couldn't read in depth, so these fluff pieces were really something they could, wrap their minds around. All right, so with the idea of the sensationalism, we have to talk about New York City. And at this time in New York City, we see the rise of yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is more or less the sensationalized news. Okay, so you take this much truth and you stretch it out, right? We had two big newspaper tycoons kind of competing against each other in New York. We had the New York World, published by Joseph Pulitzer, and then we had the New York Journal, published by William Randolph Hearst. So if you've ever watched the Newsies, it's a movie / now it's a musical on Broadway. It's all about, newspaper boys selling either Hearst or Pulitzer's newspapers. Well, anyway, these two guys, Pulitzer and Hearst, were in competition to see, they're the competition, who was going to sell the most newspapers. So they would really, really stretch the truth, huge, big flashy titles to their stories. Kind of like, for example, there was a hotel fire. Instead of just there was a hotel fire, part of the hotel burnt down, they'd use terms like hungry, frantic flames, panic-stricken, breathless fugitives gaze upon the, I can't read my writing, gaze upon the terror. So it's really really emphasizing stuff that wasn't that big of a deal, right? Just big headlines to sell papers, yellow journalism, New York. Praise the Lord. Let's keep going, shall we? All right, one last section for this video. We'll talk about Apostles of Reform, section M. So this is talking about journalists who use journalism to try to further different reform movements. And so we'll just be looking at a couple different ones here. We have the New York Nation, which is a journal, kind of like a magazine newspaper. And this New York Nation really wasn't read by a lot of people, but the Nation was really read by influential people. People like professors or publicists or, preachers. They would read this. It was launched in 1865 by Edwin Godkin, and he really wanted to see some civil service reforms, the idea of getting rid of the spoils system. He wanted to see honesty in government and a lower tariff. And he really put forth his ideas through his journal called The Nation. And it only really had about 10,000 subscribers, but it was the right people. It was the leaders really reading this, so it made an impact. Another person we see making an impact in reform movements is a guy named Henry George, a guy with two first names. All right, Henry George, he published a journal called Progress and Poverty. I shouldn't say journal, but it was like a paper here, an essay, shall we say. Progress and Poverty. And what he said is the demand for land is so high because of the increase in population that the people who own land are making profits at a very unfair rate. So he proposed the idea of having 100% tax on any profits made off of land. So he wanted to see equality, and he thought, hey, if you tax the people who are making money off of land, we'll see some equality. And you know, his ideas actually stuck around for decades. He sold about 3 million copies of this essay, Progress and Poverty. Henry George, taxing land sales. Anyway, last guy for this section we'll talk about is Edward Bellamy. 1888, he publishes a book called Looking Backward. And in this novel, it was very socialist. Socialism is the idea of very, very high taxes, but then kind of using that money for the good of all. So like socialized medicine, everyone pays high taxes, but that helps the poor get medicine, that sort of thing. So anyway, Edward Bellamy's novel, 1888, Looking Backwards, what it is the hero wakes up in the in 2000, the year 2000. So he wakes up in the year 2000, and more or less he looks backward in time and finds that all of society's woes were solved when America became socialists. In the 1880s, they nationalized big business, and then all of America's woes went away. So this is really promoting the idea of socialism through his novel. Over 1 million copies sold, and also there would be these clubs, these kind of book clubs called Bellamy Clubs spring up, and they would discuss the socialist ideas. And they had a really heavy influence on America's reform movements at this time. All right, so Section M, Apostles of Reform. We're talking about the nation, we're talking about progress and poverty, and we're talking about looking backwards. And all of these books or all of these essays really had a big impact on the way America was thinking. And I know that is enough for this section.